There's no more serious allegation in 21st century America than to be accused of racist or biased behavior. So I'm going to take this opportunity to categorically and unequivocally reject the base of the assertions made by the ACLU in their lawsuit. Now, allow me to step back for a moment. Right now, quite frankly, I don't know if I'm more indignant or depressed that this is what the ACLU wants America to think about the Milwaukee Police Department. Now, I know you can't be part of the story. You have to report the story. But many of the cameramen here today and reporters that cover this story have been in the field with our officers. You've seen the work they do. You've seen the community outreach they engage in. You've seen and reported on the physical risks they take on behalf of our community to keep it safe from crime. If they're willing to risk their lives to protect our disadvantaged communities, then the least I can do is be willing to risk lawsuits to do the same thing. The fundamental flaw of the assertions being made by this group and by others who want to drive a wedge between police and their communities is this. You absolutely cannot discuss or understand the impact of police strategies and tactics if you refuse to acknowledge the hyper-victimization of our disadvantaged communities of color inhabiting the cities of America. It is morally and intellectually dishonest, and it's a form of a lie to try to disentangle those two essential conversations. Now, every week I meet with our district commanders on our CompStat process. I talked to some of them today. You've spoken to them in the past. At no community neighborhood meeting that any of them have ever attended in any neighborhood, but most particularly our most challenged neighborhoods, have they been ever asked for less policing. The people that actually live in the neighborhoods, punctuated by gunfire and non-fatal shootings every night of the week, demand effective and responsive policing. Respectful policing, constitutional policing, thoughtful policing, but they demand to be protected. Now, the concerns of the neighborhoods are never on the agenda of groups like the ACLU because they're not accountable for taking any physical or moral risks on behalf of people who are afflicted by violence. But the police are. The honorable men and women of this department are absolutely committed to the safety of their neighborhoods. Now, here are some data points you won't hear from the ACLU. As we look at the population of Milwaukee, one of the ways we try to figure out where to deploy our resources are where crime and violence are the highest. Why? Because people need to be protected there. So in 2015, the last year we did this analysis, we looked at the rate per 100,000 of each of our groups in Milwaukee and the rate of victimization, because this is data the police department is obligated to respond to. In 2015, the homicide rate per 100,000 for Caucasians was 4.6. For African Americans and Latinos, it was 64. For non-fatal shootings, the non-fatal shooting rate per 100,000 for Caucasians was 15.7. For blacks and Latinos, it was 274. The aggravated assault rate for whites was 307. For African Americans and Latinos, it was 1,206. Now, what is my moral obligation in the light of those statistics? To carefully deploy my department so it doesn't get sued? To carefully make sure that every neighborhood gets precisely the same dosage of policing, regardless of the body count? The answer is no. Now, we need to deploy thoughtfully, But if you look at the maps we've provided many times in the past, the ellipses in this city within which there are the highest rates of poverty, unemployment, and abandoned and foreclosed homes are exactly the same locations where there are the most requested calls for service and the highest concentrations of deadly violence. Now, we're the only police department in the entire state of Wisconsin that, for purposes of transparency, tracks the impact of its strategy on the public. We track our car stops. We report our car stops. No one else in the state does. And everyone is incredibly disinterested in what the rest of the state is up to. We provide the data. We stand behind what we do because we have a moral imperative to protect people. And sadly, the same communities afflicted with the highest rates of poverty, unemployment, and substandard housing are the same communities afflicted by high rates of violence. Now, we know, for many social and historical reasons, the same communities that demand and need our services are often suspicious when they receive those services. We get it, and we've worked hard to ameliorate those concerns through a wide variety of adjustments to our tactics and strategies, working with the community. But we will not be afraid to protect people. That requires a data-driven strategy, grounded in constitutional principles, supported by academic research, proven to be evidence-based, applied fairly and impartially. Because it must be distinctly understood. Disparity is not the same as bias. The significant disparities in victimization don't prove bias on the part of violent criminals. And the disparities in the applications of police tactics are driven by the gross disparities in crime victimization in this community. And to do anything else but to be present, available, and visible in the public spaces of this city where violence is greatest would be a dereliction of duty. Now, we know that the propensity to use and carry drugs is equally distributed across all social classes, races, and ethnic groups. We know that. And this has never been about drug enforcement. But public space violence historically and consistently belongs to the poor. It has been true throughout American history, and it is now. And the people that live in those neighborhoods have a right to expect that we'll protect them. And as I said before, if my cops are willing to risk their lives to protect those communities, then I have to be willing to risk lawsuits to do the same. If you have any questions, I'm here to answer them. Yes?
You focused on the victimization of communities of color. Obviously, we know that the minority communities in Milwaukee have the highest rates of poverty and are where these allegations are coming from. I spoke recently with Sergeant Gerke about a story for a story that I wrote about dramatically lowered crime rates in Amani, which is also it's a neighborhood that's 94% African American and the highest poverty rate zip code in the city. And what was cited from both him and community members was an ability for the police and community to work together, and that was the reason why residents were taking back their community. When you yourself and the police department have acknowledged and at times lamented the lack of trust that exists between the community and the police department in the city of Milwaukee. And these 6 plaintiffs, 3 of them which spoke this morning, the ACLU said they spoke with hundreds of people before bringing this suit. It was a 3-year period where they were doing this investigation. They cited multiple public forums, listening sessions, town halls, where these same sorts of allegations came forth. And I myself, in my reporting, have spoken to numerous people who have cited similar things. So my question is, are you saying that these individuals are lying? And is there no way that these allegations could be the cause of the mistrust that exists in Milwaukee?
Well, let's disaggregate that question. First of all, I think all of you understand I'm not going to get into specific allegations of specific plaintiffs in a specific lawsuit because it'd be the wrong thing for me to do. What I'm responding to is the broad assertions based on their analysis of some of these complaints that the ACLU is making about the motivations of this police department. And I deny them categorically. Now,
bias was ever brought up, sir.
well, yes, it is, all right? And that's my concern here. That is the key issue for us. Now, we recognize that our encounters with the public are not always going to be positive ones. We know that. We also know that despite what the ACLU says about how many meetings they have, our captains go to literally hundreds of them. And the expectation is that we will protect people. And the fact is that we're doing our best to so do. As you mentioned yourself, we've got a robust partnership with Amani. It's a model program. On the north side of this city, we've gotten 3 national awards for our community-based activities because our goal in our strategy is to create strong neighborhoods. That's our goal. Our goal's never been more arrests. Our goal is to create, maintain, and sustain neighborhoods that can sustain civic life. That's our goal. That's our mission. And when we implement things like the Burn Criminal Justice Innovation Program or the Building Neighborhood Capacity Program in places like Amani and Washington Park, that is absolutely to apply community policing principles, but also to continue to apply evidence-based policing practices to protect people. There are not safe neighborhoods without physical safety. Now, that's a given. I'm not going to argue every point made by every individual that's got a beef with the Milwaukee Police Department. I will say that our strategy is firmly grounded in evidence-based policing practices and constitutional practices. That's my overarching point.
These are hundreds of
Well, then I'll let somebody else answer a question there. Yeah.
Chief, you mentioned in your statement earlier that the department does not use the stop and frisk tactic. So can you respond to them saying that's what these people are saying happens out in the community?
Well, I think they're using a term of art that was very successfully used in New York City because that's where they come from. Stop and frisk is entirely different of what we're doing. What we've been doing is using lawful traffic enforcement in public spaces to affect the environment. Now, when we put this in place, we were very aware of the fact that if we did enhanced traffic enforcement in the neighborhoods where crime is highest, the Department of Transportation, the United States Department of Transportation funds something called the DDAX program. The United States Department of Justice funds the Violence Reduction Network. We're involved in both United States government-funded initiatives. And what DDAX is about is recognizing that the highest accident locations are often co-located with your most violent crime areas. And if you doubt me, go to a neighborhood meeting sometime in our high crime neighborhoods, and the number one concern is crazy driving. All right, last year we had more people killed by stolen cars than by armed robbers. So traffic enforcement of those neighborhoods is very concerning as well. What we found, and the research indicates that if regular officers just do traffic enforcement, that has a direct impact on robberies and car thefts. Just does. But we knew if we applied it and wrote citations, we would be in fact imposing a cost on the same neighborhoods we were protecting, because the poorest neighborhoods with the most crime would be getting tickets. So we overwhelmingly instructed our officers use lawful law enforcement tactics to identify driving violations, but if there's any way to give them a warning, do so. And 80% of our traffic stops that are traffic violations result in warnings. That is done to ease the impact of a tactic that we have shown year after year directly correlates with reductions in non-fatal shootings, robberies, and car thefts. Now, those victimizations occur in those same communities. Now, that's an evidence-based practice. It's not a bias-based practice. We're not trying to inflict ourselves on communities of color. We are dealing with one of the symptoms of the host of social challenges that many of these neighborhoods are operating under, and one of them is violent crime. And application of this tactic is proven to reduce those levels of violence.
Chief, can
Yes.
you respond to the allegation in the lawsuit that these stops are happening without any reasonable cause?
Well, the reasonable cause is traffic violation. We're not, here's where people kind of muddy the waters on purpose. They want to get into whether or not we're recovering contraband. And that presupposes that's the goal of the stop. No, the goal of the stop is to enforce traffic laws and have an impact on driving behavior in public spaces and the behavior of people who are watching the police be active in their public spaces. The result is impacts on crime. Now, the reason the DDAX program exists, which is data-driven anti-crime and traffic stops, is because it's been proven time and time again. An active police department that gets out of its cars enforcing traffic laws affects perceptions of safety. It affects the fear level. It affects the fact that people believe those public spaces are being watched. What we did differently, and the whole thing about the stop and frisk, the New York City people came to Milwaukee because they couldn't understand how we were doing so many car stops with so few citizen complaints, because they were getting jacked up. And the key difference was in New York City, they felt the need to document their interactions with an enforcement action. So no matter how minor the violation was, whether it was drinking in public or a small amount of marijuana or loitering in the street, they documented it through a citation. Their municipal citations went through the roof. And it got to a point of diminishing returns where the communities they were trying to protect truly did feel harassed because they were getting fined all over the place. And they were getting warrants against themselves for not paying the fines. We avoided that trap completely. Why? Because we said the goal here is to affect behavior, not raise revenue. And so we have the ancillary but direct and proven benefit of an impact not only on injuries from accidents, but also on violent crime. That's the goal. And it was absolutely done at the behest of communities who want to see more police activity, not as a way of inflicting an alien presence on them.
Chief, what would you say to families who truly are anxious about being in the community for being unfairly stopped by police?
Well, that's part of a necessary community conversation that hasn't occurred yet because people that seem to want to push only the impact of police tactics refuse to have. We don't do victim blaming here. All right, the disadvantages of disadvantaged neighborhoods are plenty enough, and suffering violence is one of them. The conversation we want to have, and if you saw me at the town hall with President Obama last August, that was the question I asked him. I said, you're the only person, I said, I've got a job for you post-presidency. We need to connect the disparate conversations that on the left hand, it's all about police activity, but on the neighborhood level, it's all about fear of crime. We've got to join those conversations. I've been in this business a long time. Nobody gets more than cops some of the ambivalence at the neighborhood level about what we do. Okay? We understand. We've all seen the movies. You know, the movies of Selma in your head in 1968. That movie plays in everybody's head. We know the police have at times in American history been used by political establishments to enforce unjust laws. And we know that people that are afflicted by crime have sometimes experienced police response to crime as frightening and alienating. We know all of those things. But the fact of the matter is there are not limitless tools the police have at their disposal. They've got to work with communities, but the conversation that needs to occur, the conversation I'd rather have with the ACLU, is okay, guys, you're right. There is a disparate impact of police engagement in trying to reduce crime. And there is a gross disparate impact on victimization by crime. I think last time we looked, African Americans were 15 times more likely to get shot than white folks, okay? That's crazy. No one should have to live like that. So how do we join those conversations? I mean, we do fair and impartial police training. We ground our people in constitutional principles. We tell them use traffic, not random suspicion, as reasons to stop people. We give them information about the hot spots, the chart on the wall, the 10% of offenders who generate 50% of the crime, the 10% of places that generate 60% of the crime. We work hard to refine our tactics and strategies. And at the neighborhood level, we have conversations. But that conversation's got to get elevated. We've got to get beyond the finger pointing that does nothing except to de-police at-risk communities. That's not anybody's goal. And there's a better way to do that than lawsuits, and there's a better way to do that than cherry-picking data to prove a point while ignoring relevant data that has to do to the problem to which we're responding.
Chief, you mentioned traffic stops a few times. The lawsuit says, though, that some of these stops are also pedestrians. Is that part of this strategy you are speaking about in targeting crime in these high crime areas?
Field interviews are one of the strategies used, which are pedestrian interviews. But once again, the goal was never to generate enforcement. If you look at the longitudinal data on our issuance of municipal citations, they're dramatically down, even though field interviews were up. Again, the goal was not revenue raising, harassment, or the imposition of fines and warrants on people unable to pay them. The goal was to affect behavior in public spaces, because it's proven time and time again, if the police under-police or abandon public spaces, they become dangerous because it appears that no one cares. You got a question?
Well, the frisk part of it, is there, I think the allegation here was there's not really firm guidelines for supervisors to check on patrol officers. What's the frisk policy?
Well, our frisk policy is, grounded in constitutional principles, which is you've got to have an articulable suspicion to frisk someone. We give training to people on what they call characteristics of the armed offender. That clearly describes circumstances in which you have an articulable suspicion to pat somebody down. Absent that, we don't expect people to pat them down. So it's not been a circumstance that we have advocated or that we have trained for. We train people to use frisk in the context of articulable suspicion.
So what are officers looking for? You mentioned that field interviews is a part of the whole strategy. So if someone's just walking down the street, what are they looking for to be able to stop that person? Because if I'm just minding my business, walking down the street, but at the same time doing field interviews, as you say, as a part of that strategy to reduce crime, what specifically are they looking for to kind of, I guess, ease people's minds? Because it could just be people are thinking it's just their skin color that they're seeing.
Well, one of the things we started to do only in the recent months is just measure citizen contacts that were non-confrontational. Because we do a lot of talking to people. One of the things I want cops to do is get out of their cars and talk to people. Now, technically, those are all field interviews. But the idea was to get out of the car and talk to people. So we tell people to go on park and walks. We tell them, if they're on bicycle patrol or foot patrol, purpose is to engage with the community. Now, there are going to be times in places where they're going to observe some form of suspicious behavior or behavior in which they can lawfully intervene. So, for example, if folks are drinking in public, here's an ironic one that a lot of people don't understand. We will often question people sitting on a porch. Now, your first thought is, my God, this is their house, this is their castle. How can you do that? Well, we've learned the hard way that a lot of young men sitting on porches don't live there. And whoever does live there is inside that house too scared to call the police. And so we'll make an inquiry. Do you live here? Anybody inside can vouch for you? Oh, okay. Have a nice day. But if it turns out nobody lives there, it's going to be a move on, or it's going to be a question. Well, why are you here? Who are you? What's your name? Where do you come from? Now, we try to push a lot of information out into the hands of our officers about known offenders in their neighborhoods, people who've committed offenses at a high rate. Our goal is to put them in a position where they better know the neighborhood based on their own contacts with the community, as well as information about folks that are victimizing the community, because it enables them to use their authority more discreetly, which is what we all want. If we're going to be intervening, we don't want to be the stranger police. And that's why we worked hard to have steady assignments of officers to beats and sectors, and that's why we spend a lot of time doing community outreach.
So you're not denying that you're stopping, quote unquote, stopping more people. You're not denying that, but that's because that's a part of the strategy, right? To be able to intervene with more people and in effect to reduce crime?
That's the goal,
Okay.
Now, over the course of time, we noticed that the field interviews didn't correlate. The amount of field interviews didn't correlate with reductions in non-fatal shootings or robberies. And so we measure everything, we continue to, but we stopped examining them as an indice of appropriate, not appropriate, but of our tactics, because they weren't having a discernible impact. So that number's dropped significantly, and that's fine with us. But we have started to track, as I say, positive citizen contacts, because we don't want to discourage cops from talking to people.
That's because you're just interacting with more people.
That's a big piece of it. It's not just, hey, who are you, why are you here? We got to do both.
Is the data analyzed to make sure that there isn't a difference based on rates? You mentioned reports that are put out. Is that then analyzed to make sure that, you know?
Here's what we analyze. We look at every district, and we look at, for example, traffic stops, described offenders, and described victims. The reason we do that is because that gives us a much more accurate look at where this is occurring. If I know the victim population in a location where a car stop is occurring, I've got a pretty good read on who lives there. Who are they going to encounter at that time and place? We do it by district. And when we do it that way, disparities virtually disappear. That district after district, the car stops reflect who lives and offends in that neighborhood. For most violent crimes, victims and offenders look the same. Property crimes is different, but for violent crimes, victims and offenders look the same. So grounding our proactive police activity in those metrics gives us a much better read as to whether or not some form of unconscious or conscious bias is at play. I mean, when you're in a location that's, 80-some% of the victims are African American, and 91% of the offenders are African American, and 75% of the car stops are African American, well, that doesn't look like a glaring issue. But if you've got community in which offenders and victims are 0 and 0, but stops are 70%, well, then you'd have a problem. Okay, that indicates to me there's conscious or unconscious bias. But we haven't had any example of any district that had anything anywhere near that far out of whack.